I'm excited to welcome you here tonight on the traditional territory of the Wet'suwet'en, and it's an honor to be here as always. Tonight is part of a collaborative initiative by the town of Smithers, Northern Health, and the Bulkley Valley Social Planning Society. We all know that the Bulkley Valley is a pretty amazing place to live, and I think our job as, whether you're a community leader or a community member or a volunteer or you work with a nonprofit organization or you're an entrepreneur, our jobs, or part of our jobs, is to make this an even better place. But what does better mean exactly? And how do we know if we're moving forward as a community or, as the case may be, moving backwards? So the goal of this collaborative project is to convene a conversation as a community about what it is that we value. And then secondly, to come up with a set of indicators that we can use over time to measure exactly that, whether we are indeed, as a community, getting better. So there are two parts to this initiative. The first one is tonight, when we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Trevor Hancock to give a presentation. And tomorrow there's going to be an all-day workshop where we've invited over 60 people from different organizations and agencies across the full diversity of our community to sit down together for a full day and talk about what it is that the community values and what those indicators might be. And ultimately this is going to lead to hopefully an annual report card that will give us a snapshot of how Smithers is doing in all of its dimensions. So tonight and tomorrow are really the product of a hard-working working group representing the three partners. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge the work of all of the members of that group. And I believe most of them, except one, are here tonight. And those are Cormac Hickish with Northern Health, and also with Northern Health, Teresa Healy, Sabrina Desange Gantner, and Shane Wadden. From the Bulkley Valley Social Planning Society, Don Hansen and Melanie Mons. And from the town of Smithers, Councillor Bill Goodacre, who's here this evening, myself, and we had the wonderful staff support of our town planner, Liliana Dragowska, and our administrator, Susan Bassett. So thanks to all of them for all of the work they've put into this. Funding for tonight is provided by Northern Health through its Partnering for Healthier Communities initiative, and also the village of Telkwa. And I noticed that His Worship Mayor Darcy Reppin is here tonight. After the presentation, there's going to be a chance to ask any questions you might have of Dr. Hancock, and as well, if there's something that's inspired you, we invite you just outside the door. There's a huge piece of paper on the wall, and there are a bunch of pens. And so if the spirit moves you, grab a pen and write your thoughts or your ideas on the wall, and that will become part of the process tomorrow. So Dr. Trevor Hancock, it's a real pleasure to have him here in the Valley. Trevor is a public health physician, and he's a professor at the New School of Public Health and Social Policy at the University of Victoria. He's one of the founders of the Global Healthy Cities and Communities movement, and he's just returned from speaking at a major international conference in Australia. And as he was telling us at dinner, Dr. Hancock is also a Morris dancer. So I don't know, do we have any Morris dancers in Smithers? So he's promised that if he notices anyone dozing off, he's going to break into Morris dancing, and that's going to shake things up quite a bit. So please join me in giving a warm Bulkley Valley welcome to Dr. Trevor.
And it's a pleasure to be here for the first time, I should add. First time I've been here. It's really lovely. I could see myself coming back quite easily, so make me an offer. Although maybe you should wait and hear what I have to say first and then see if you want to make me an offer. You've actually had a Morris dancer in your community. How many people here knew Dr. Alan Wilson? Well, I dance with Alan. He's a Morris dancer. He retired to Victoria, and he's kind of given up dancing because he wrecked his knee, but he plays for us. So you already had the beginnings of a Morris side here, little did you know it. So, I am going to talk this evening about this topic, and it is based substantially on a presentation I actually gave yesterday morning, and I love that when I can string stuff together. Not only because it makes life easy for me, but because it makes interesting connections. And this particular connection is to this document, which I will talk about a bit later. This is a document released yesterday morning in Victoria. It's the Victoria Community Foundation's 10th annual Vital Signs report. And it is very much about the sort of things that you're here to talk about this evening and again tomorrow all day. And I wrote a feature essay in this year's report called Measuring What Matters. So yesterday morning when the foundation launched, I gave essentially this talk. And I think it's important because the issues you're talking about here are not just issues for here. These conversations are happening across the country. They're not happening, as I'll come to later, at the federal and provincial levels, sadly, but they are happening where it counts most, and that's at the local level. And the reason that I spent a lot of my time doing healthy cities and healthy communities is because that's where change happens. That's where real change happens. And if you want to create real change, don't go to Ottawa. Probably don't even go to Victoria. Get involved locally, make things happen locally, because that's where real change happens. And eventually, the federal and provincial levels wake up and get inspired by what's happening at the local level. And the other point about this, of course, is that you've got lots of other communities. We were talking over dinner about the fact that Prince George is getting interested in doing this too, and other communities around. And so you can all learn from each other as well. So there's wonderful opportunities here, and I want to really congratulate you on what you're doing. Dawn Hanson gave me this little 3-pager, I don't know how many people have seen it yet, about what you're doing here. It's quite wonderful. In fact, it's so wonderful, I'm reminded of a Sufi story that John McKnight used to tell. How many people here know John McKnight? Okay, so John McKnight is I don't have many mentors actually in my life, but he's definitely one of them. He was one of the people who created, or helped to create the whole concept, was key to create the concept of what's now known as asset-based community development. And asset-based community development is really very simple. This isn't quite true given this. Hang on a second. No, it's not beer. Is that glass half full or half empty? And as a society, we tend, and as communities often, we tend to only talk about how it's half empty. All of the issues, the problems that need fixing, the services we have to pour in, and so on. But what we forget is that it's half full. And that's what asset-based community development is about. It's about, don't start by listing all your problems, but start with what are our assets, what are our capacities, what strengths do we have, what can we build on. And I learned from Edmonton, from some social planning work there years ago, that you don't talk about building capacity as if there was no capacity. You talk about building on capacity, because there is an existing capacity there that you can build on and strengthen, and that's a great strength. So the Sufi story that we worked with John McKnight in the early 1980s in Toronto when we were introducing, or in some senses I guess you'd say reintroducing 75 years later, the idea that public health should do community development. And so we brought John McKnight up because he was one of the great leaders in that thinking then. And the story that he tells is of a small community, could have been Smithers, that had a lot of problems. And over in the next village, they knew there was a wise woman. And so they sent for her to come and help them. And so she came to the village and everyone assembled in the main square. And she said to them, "Do you know what to do?" And they said, "No." She said, "Well then, I can't help you." And she left. So they were a bit puzzled by this, and they thought about this for a while. And then they invited her back. And she came back and stood in the square, and she said to them all again, "Do you know what to do?" And they all said, "Yes." And she said, "Then you don't need me." And she left. And so, again, they thought about this, and this wasn't really what they were expecting, so they had a big conversation. And then they invited her back for a third time. And when she stood in front of them again, as they knew she would, and she said, "Do you know what to do?" Half of them said yes, and the other half said no. And she said, "Well, would those of you who know what to do, please talk to those who don't know what to do?" And she left, and she never came back. And of course, the point of the story is that we have the capacity and the assets within our community. We don't need a lot of outside expertise to come in, people like me. So I'm going to leave right now. Except I know Teresa would be terribly upset if I left without saying anything. So for Teresa, only for Teresa, I'll do this. So, measuring progress, what business are we in anyway? Good question. I think it's a good question. So here's what I'm going to talk about. If you measure wrongly, you manage wrongly. I'm not sure that's very grammatical, but it gets the point across. So focus on what matters, and what matters in Smithers, and I'm going to actually compare and contrast that a bit with what matters in Victoria, and then what are some of the implications. So I'm going to better get my little watch out here and keep an eye on the time, because we want some time to talk, go to the pub and important things like that. So here's good business management speak. We've all heard this, government management speak. We manage what we measure. So, the implication of that is that what you can't measure, you can't manage. The problem with that is that what you measure is what you end up managing. So you only manage what you measure. And the problem with that is that if you measure the wrong things, or if you measure them in the wrong way, then you end up managing only what you measure and not necessarily what matters, what you should be managing. So if we don't measure what matters, then we don't end up managing what matters. And so it's really important at the outset to identify what matters. And that's some of the work you've been doing here with the community table talks. What really matters? Then you can go and measure what you've decided matters, and then you can manage what matters. Because so often in life we end up managing what really doesn't matter. And that's one of our key challenges. Here's a case in point, the GDP. Everybody knows about the GDP. We're in the middle of an election. Half of the time all we hear about is, did the GDP grow? Did it not grow? How much did it grow? Are we in recession? What does the GDP tell us about that? Blah, 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 blah. It's totally... There's a phrase in the indicators world about leading indicators. All you can really say about the GDP, which stands for gross domestic product, by the way, is that it is a gross measure of progress, and it is a misleading indicator. In fact, Simon Kuznets, who was one of the people who established the measurement of GDP in the 1930s in America, warned the US Congress, as you read there, that the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measure of national income. But in fact, that's what we do. We focus on GDP. As I said, the current election campaign, public policy largely becomes a matter of maximizing GDP. We navigate by GDP to a very large extent, particularly at national and global levels. And as a result, the Ministry of Finance becomes our most important ministry. The problem is, GDP is a lousy measure of progress. And I don't think people understand that, and I don't think people navigating our societies and communities understand that, and that's really quite tragic, actually. So GDP, for example, all of the economic activity of the tobacco industry is counted within GDP. It contributes to GDP. And all of the economic activity of the healthcare system in fixing the health problems caused by tobacco also gets counted into GDP. Does that sound sensible to you? Doesn't sound sensible to me. When the Exxon Valdez ran aground and spilled its oil cargo in Prince William Sound in Alaska, 20 years or so ago, a bit more than that maybe. That added hundreds of millions of dollars to the Alaskan and American GDP. Does that make sense, that that's a good thing for the economy? Or cleaning up after a hurricane, or the money we spend on war? All of that is seen as contributing to GDP. At the same time, GDP doesn't include these kind of things. It doesn't include the non-monetized contributions because we can't count them economically as part of national income. So all of the volunteer activity, and you're like every other community, everybody here, I'm sure almost everyone is involved in some sort of volunteer activity. Does that contribute to making your community a better place to live? You bet it does. Does it get counted into GDP? Not at all. It may as well not exist. The same for growing your own food, raising kids, caring for family and friends, and so on. So all of that stuff that builds community, that builds healthy and happier lives, or more secure lives, or whatever, doesn't count in GDP. So the problem is you can actually build GDP by harming health, or more broadly, human capital, human development. You can harm the environment and then try to fix it, or harm health and then try to fix it, and all of that adds to GDP. But when you build social capital, the kind of volunteer work and social connections I was talking about, you're not building GDP. So, bottom line, it's a pretty lousy measure. I'll give you a more vivid and personal illustration of that. Think about this question for a minute. If you've had this question asked of you before and you know the answer, be quiet. If you haven't seen the question before, what do you think? Where would you invest your 10 cents to maximize return on GDP? Anybody? Education, common answer. Yeah.
Early childcare.
Early childcare. Somebody usually says clean water. War, yeah, I don't buy a lot of bullets for 10 cents, but every little bit helps, I suppose. The answer is, you buy a 10-cent book of matches and you burn this building to the ground. Think about it. Think about the economic activity you would unleash if you did that. All of the work of fighting the fire, demolishing the building, redesigning and rebuilding the building, re-equipping the building, finding temporary office and school space in the meantime, on and on and on. You'd add millions of dollars to the GDP. You'd have done the country a real favour. Right? It's a pretty stupid way of measuring progress, let's face it. So, okay, Mr. Smart Guy, are there any alternatives? Well, there's lots of them, actually. And it's still a developing field and a developing set of skills, because this one's been in place for almost 100 years now, so it's kind of what we're used to doing. Now, there's a scary thought. I used to think the 1930s were just yesterday, and I just realized they're almost 100 years ago, 85 anyway. How many people here have heard of the Genuine Progress Indicator? Okay, a few. Canadian Index of Wellbeing. Happy Planet Index. That's a more recent one. It's my current favourite. Gross National Happiness. That one, yeah, that one's got quite a bit of exposure. So these are all alternatives, and I'll tell you a little bit about each of them. The GPI basically starts with the same numbers as the GDP, but then what it does is it, instead of adding all of those costs from harmful activity, it subtracts them. It says, no, actually spending $200 million on cleaning up after the Exxon Valdez is not a benefit, it's a cost, and we're going to subtract it, and so on. And it also estimates and tries to build in a monetized version of what your worth is and your contribution is through all your volunteer activities and all the rest of it. And then they also do a lot of other adjustments And it says see hidden slides for details, but actually I don't think those hidden slides are included in this particular presentation. But I can send them to you if anybody's really interested, or you can go look it up. The great God Google will take you there. So it adjusts for income distribution and so on. What is the result? This is kind of revealing. The green line at the top there is real GDP per capita in the US from 1950 to 2004. The blue line is GPI. I think this kind of explains the notion that we're doing better and feeling worse. So economically we're doing better. The GPI, you'll notice, has really not increased since about the 1980s, even the 1970s. So we're actually not, in GPI terms, making progress. Same applies globally. So there's global numbers, and again you'll see basically the GPI has sort of been flatlined since the 1970s, or even declining a bit. So that might be a more useful way for us to navigate, is to understand that while we may appear on the face of it to be making progress and doing better, we're actually not. This is the Canadian Index of Wellbeing. Now, the Canadian Index of Wellbeing is interesting because it inspired, in part, the vital signs that's the basis of this report and other reports like it, and very similar to the categories that you talk about. So they have 8 categories of quality of life, and you can read them on the left there: community vitality, democratic engagement, education, environment, and so on. On the right, you will see that the Canadian Index of Wellbeing since 1995 or thereabouts, 94, really has only increased a little bit, and only, and then now in fact has been declining a bit since about 2008, while GDP's been going up. So a different index, different set of categories of indicators, but a similar sort of story. We're not doing as well as the GDP would make us think we are. This one's the Happy Planet Index. It's created by the Alternative Economic Foundation in the UK. Used to be called the Other Economic Summit, I forget its current name, but anyway. Sorry? Oh, I thought someone had it for me. So what this measures is happy life years, and when they say happy life years, they basically mean disability-free life years. So it's life expectancy minus that part of life expectancy when you're in bad health. So it's disability-free life expectancy sometimes. So it's a measure similar to that, happy life years per ecological footprint. So the ideal, given that we all have to live on one small blue planet, is to have a good quality of life with a small ecological footprint. And that green area up to the left is kind of the happy zone, if you like. Not many countries are there. The ones that are close to there, you'll notice, a lot of them are in Latin America, which is kind of interesting. The top 3 countries in this particular one, which I think was 2012 or so, the top 3 countries were Costa Rica, Vietnam, and Colombia, because they have pretty good quality of life according to their stats, and yet small ecological footprints. So we could actually learn something from that. And you'll notice, if you look at the color codes, the red means 2 or more components that are in the poor category, and the Western world is the square dots. So that's the Happy Planet Index, another way which brings in more explicitly the ecological footprint. And there's those answers. Did I remember correctly? Yes, I did. Costa Rica, Vietnam, Colombia. Canada, you'll notice, is 65th in the Happy Planet Index. We're actually not part of the G7 or even the G20 in Happy Planet terms. And the USA is 105th out of 151. So again, what you measure matters. If you navigate by GDP, you end up in one place, where the USA is, for example, or Canada, and you end up in a very different place if you measure with the Happy Planet Index. So these are all global scale, but actually you can do these kind of things. GPI can be done for a city, for example, or a community, not GPI, ecological footprint, and you could then calculate, might be interesting actually, I hadn't really thought about it, but I wonder what Smithers Happy Planet Index would be. I'm not sure if you can get the happy life expectancy data at this scale, but anyway, it's a thought. And then the fourth one is gross national happiness, which comes out of a Buddhist philosophy and was created by the King of Bhutan back in 1972 in response to GDP, the notion of GDP, based on the premise that the true development of human society takes place when material and spiritual development occur side by side. So it's very much a Buddhist philosophy and worldview. But the four pillars should be quite familiar to us: promotion of equitable and sustainable socioeconomic development. So it's not saying no socioeconomic development, it's saying yes, but it has to be both sustainable and equitable. Preservation and promotion of cultural values, conservation of the natural environment, and establishment of good governance. Anybody here who doesn't want those four things? The interesting thing in all of this, as I sort of hinted at the outset, is municipalities get this. That municipalities, I don't know any municipality whose first measure of progress or quality or anything is GDP. Municipalities don't measure GDP. What they measure is quality of life in a variety of different ways: the vitality index, the vital signs, the sustainable communities indicators. In the case of the FCM is the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. They've had a quality of life reporting system for 20 or so years, involving mainly larger cities. So municipalities get it. Municipalities get that it's about quality of life. So the kind of indicators I just showed to you, they may not appeal at a global or national level, but they are appealing at a local level if you can find the data to tailor them. And incidentally, any reference to tailoring anything to the Smithers situation is purely and simply an election plug for the mayor, okay? May as well be clear about that. No, it isn't. Community foundations also get it, and lots of other local organizations get it. So, if GDP is wrong, if there are alternative measures, what does matter? What should we be focusing on? And we need to do two things. You need to focus on what matters to us as a community. What do we care about? Because what Prince George cares about, or what Prince Rupert cares about, or what Victoria cares about, may or may not be what Smithers cares about. So some things will be common, but some things will be uniquely Smithers. You know, you really care about the fact that it's clear and sunny every time a tourist hits town so they can see the mountain. And so that becomes important to you, or whatever it may be. And if you know what matters, then you can measure what matters, and then you can manage what matters. And that's going to make a difference. So what business are we in? Are we really here on Earth? Is our purpose in life to grow the economy? Do we only exist to maximize profit? Or is there something more? And I've already said, local governments get it. It's about quality of life. It's about what people talk about as people-centered or human-centered development. In a sense, it's about us. It's about how are we, both as individuals and more importantly as a community, how are we doing as people? And in the context of the place in which we live and the planet on which we live, yes, but it's really about us, and that's what matters. So I would argue that the central focus of governance, and here I'm talking governance, not just government, but governance and also of government should be to maximize the health, the well-being, the quality of life, the level of human development of people. We should have people-centered governance. It has to be done in an ecologically sustainable manner. And growing an economy can be part of that. This is not a diatribe against economic development. It's not a diatribe against growth per se. It is a diatribe, if you like, against the wrong sort of economic development. And so, what kind of economic development would contribute more to the kind of goals and purposes that I'm talking about? My favourite, most succinct way to put this was Jim Rouse, who was a developer of Columbia, Maryland, and interestingly, when I talked about this yesterday, someone in the audience said they worked with Jim Rouse a long time ago and loved what he'd done in Columbia. He was a developer of a community called Columbia in Maryland, and his sort of instructions to his design team, and I would flag this for the urban planners in the audience, build me a garden to grow people in. Now I think that's quite a lovely image of what a community should be. A garden to grow people in. And if we could figure out how to do that and do that well, we'd all be a lot better off. And we do it, I must say, not too badly, certainly in some places. And that's one of the comforting things about this. It's not like we have to go out and reinvent or invent new stuff. Lots of people know how to do this. Lots of people are doing this in lots of places. We can learn from them. For example, Medellin, which is in Colombia. And I've had the privilege of going there a couple of times. Very interesting place, kind of scary place, if you remember the drug cartels down there. This was a city that 15 or so years ago, a city of about 2 million, the size of Toronto, had 10,000 murders a year. Toronto has 50 or 60. Very violent place. Drug cartels, violence, there was a guerrilla war going on with the FARC and so on. They wanted to turn it round, and part of how they've turned it round, and there's a lot more to this story than I can tell you right now, but part of it is they refocused what the city was all about and what their urban plan was all about. And they talked about in their urban planning guidelines that the physical structure of the city had to support education and culture and human development. That's a very kind of different focus for urban planning. In fact, when I was there, I had a meeting with the director of planning and his team, and at one point, this guy who I really liked leaned over to me and he said, kind of sort of voce a bit, he said, well, you know, of course, urban planning is all about happiness. I thought it was quite lovely. We've got one or two urban planners in the audience. Were you taught that urban planning was about happiness? Why wouldn't we teach that? Why wouldn't that be the purpose? I used to kind of rag our urban planners in Toronto in the early days of healthy cities by saying, well, what exactly is your outcome measure of good urban planning? And we kind of agreed that really at that point in the early 1980s, the outcome measure was the right pile of stuff went up in the right shape to the right height in the right place. And that was about it. They weren't doing pre- and post-occupancy surveys, they weren't doing evaluation of the impact on people, any of that. We're 80% urbanized, we spend 90% of our time indoors. We're in the natural, quote-unquote, human habitat of the 21st century right now. When I get to be king for a day, which I'm hoping is going to happen soon, one of my rules is going to be that architects have to live and work in the spaces they design. Because we don't do a great job, frankly, of designing healthy hospitals or healthy schools or healthy, and I'm not imputing this school or any other particular place, but just generally we don't do a great job. We haven't, because that's not been the purpose, the outcome measure. We need to change that. So that's Medellin, as just one example. Big city, but the right idea. So, we need to focus on what matters. So what matters in Smithers? Well, I was sent the report from the table talk sessions earlier this year. So I'm going to play back some of that to you. How many people here have seen that report? Okay, the rest of you, there will be a test tomorrow, so go home and read it. I assume it's available.
Yes, on the website.
On the website, good, there you go. So, 2 questions. What things do you love about Smithers today? Basically, those are what are the assets of Smithers. And what changes would you embrace to make it better? So those are kind of the issues. What are the challenges or problems? And the mayor, who I'm told is also known as Mayor Bike-Rack, by the way. I've been kicking up on local gossip in my few hours in town. There are nicknames and there are nicknames. That's a pretty damn decent nickname, I must say. Sorry to everybody, just embarrassed you to put my foot in it, but there you go. So anyway, he grouped the answers together. That's a lot better than having a nickname like Mayor Smog, let's face it. So, what do you love in Smithers? Well, this is what you said you loved. And I'm assuming these were roughly in order of importance. I didn't actually check that, is that right?
No.
Taylor?
I don't believe so.
No, okay, so it's just a clustering. But there's some interesting stuff there, and good stuff. So that's basically the stuff you love. Look familiar? Sound familiar? Probably does. Hopefully some of you at least were part of that. On the other hand, what are some of the issues to address? Well, there's the list of issues to address. The interesting thing about these 2 lists, and I'll give you just a moment to scan it, but if you run your eye down that list, and then I'm just going to go back, if you run your eye down that list, sometimes the same thing crops up in both. So, yes, the glass is half empty, but also the glass is half full. So these are some of the issues where what I take to be essentially the same issue is on both sides of the ledger. I'm not sure that necessarily shopping equates with downtown and Main Street, but that was just my assumption. This grouping is not Taylor's, that's my grouping. But I think there's a lot of parallels where essentially what people were saying as well, it's okay, but it could be better. And those are the things where it's okay and could be better. And again, I've sort of made an assumption around civic engagement equating to planning and process. But that's my equating. But equally interesting, there were some assets that aren't considered issues, aren't considered, if you like, problems. And they all revolve around the same kind of thing, really, what I would call probably social capital. So it's all about how this community works together, how it makes stuff happen, about civic engagement and about diversity. That's not seen as a problem at all, that's purely an asset in that list. And that's very interesting and very good and something you definitely want to protect. On the other hand, there were some issues on the list that weren't seen as assets. One of those, incidentally, land use, is interesting because actually your land is a major asset for the community. How you use it may be an issue, but the land itself is an asset. So those are some of the issues that are prevalent here. I just want to compare very quickly to what they were finding in the Vital Signs report, because there's a lot of parallels and some differences. So here's what this category of issue areas are that they've developed over the last 10 years in Victoria. And if you just run your eye down that list, you'll see many similarities in there. I point out a couple that you won't see, and I'll point out some more in a minute. But learn in the bottom left didn't feature in your categorization. Maybe it's there, maybe it's buried in other details or in other social issues or something. Similarly, safety didn't feature. But then when you live in smaller communities, it often doesn't because of all of that previous collection of social capital issues that we talked about. And it doesn't feature, incidentally, all that highly in Victoria. It's not a major issue, it's sort of 8th or 10th on the list. Here's more information. So these are, again, they do the same thing as you. So at the top, the issues, the challenges, the problems, the half empty. And at the bottom, the best, the assets, and of course, living where we do, the top three assets are the natural environment, the climate, and the air quality. So, guess why people move to Victoria. But there's no point in going through all of this list. I just want to draw attention to a few things that weren't noted in Smithers in my very quick viewing of that list that Mayor Backrack put together, but they may in fact be subsumed in there. I may be missing stuff, so don't take this as gospel. But learning and education features very highly in Victoria. It didn't seem to leap out from what I saw here. You wonder why. Mental illness and addictions is a big issue. In fact, if you combine those two, which are separated for some reason in the Victoria survey, they end up being the number 2 issue, in fact. Safety, I've already mentioned. Issues around the cost of living and the standard of living and poverty, which are quite big. Well, poverty's not so big, but standard and cost of living are in Victoria. Didn't exactly feature, but you had issues like economy, which may be a collection that covers that. So all I'm saying is it's worth thinking about what's not there. I pointed out in Victoria that what was not there, in fact, was diversity in their set of categories. And also what was not there was heritage, protection of heritage, which featured in yours. So every community is a little bit different in what it values and what it thinks its issues are, and that's a good thing. But it does mean it's sometimes a little difficult to make comparisons with other communities. Local food actually was in yours, I think. I'm mistaken on that one. I remember seeing it. So, for you, the key questions are, how do you preserve your assets? You've got some great assets here, particularly social capital. And how do you address your issues? And how do you strengthen those assets that you're sort of saying, well, it's an asset, but it's not quite there yet, it needs some improvement. And if you're going to do all those things, you need to be able to measure them. If you're saying, and this is a very interesting one, that these things are things you really value, that these are assets that you have in Smithers and in the Berkeley Valley, that they're not issues, they're not problems at all, they don't feature on that side. But how would you measure that? How would you measure it in a way that makes sense? So, let me tell you another story. 20 or 30 years ago on the island of Maui in Hawaii, they were doing some economic development, bringing in hydro, things like that. And there was a lot of concern about what the impact of this would be on the community or communities. And so they did a whole exercise, a bit like what you've been doing, of going around to these communities and talking to them about what they valued, what mattered. And in one of the communities, the community said, well, right now we're a bit concerned. We don't have a lot of tourists that come by. We're not sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing if they come by, but we don't have a lot as far as we know. But we don't have but how would we measure that? So the researchers, being wise people, did what the wise woman did in my early story, and they said, well, you go figure it out. And so the community went away and talked about how would it measure tourist visits. And when they came back with an indicator that 3 PhDs would never have come up with. And they said, this is, remember, 20 or 30 years ago when these things still existed, we're going to measure the number of rows of film for sale in our local store. And if the number of rows of film for sale goes up, we know we're getting more tourists. Nobody with a PhD would have come up with that one. And the other one, even better. And I checked this one out with a PhD, and she agreed, didn't you, Teresa, that you would never have figured this one. They said, well, we really value our slow pace of life. Anybody here value the slow pace of life in Smithers? I bet some of you do. Okay, how would you measure the slow pace of life? That was the challenge to the community, because the researchers had no idea how to measure the slow pace of life. So the community went away and they talked about it. And they came back and they said, we're going to count the number of alarm clocks in the village. And if it goes up, we know we're losing our slow pace of life. It's a beautiful indicator. It's an indicator that would never have come out of a research lab. So it's really important to think about what made sense for us. And of course, the beauty of that particular indicator is it was a warning indicator. So it was telling you, if this starts to happen, you've got a problem. So these are some of the issues and domains. Those of you who are there tomorrow morning will be working on these, so I just wanted to share them because it comes out of all of this earlier discussion. That's where I knew I'd seen food production somewhere. So these are the issues that have come out. It might be worth reflecting tomorrow, and I actually don't exactly know the process for tomorrow, so I'm probably causing all kinds of problems for the organisers. I apologise if I am, but it might be worth thinking about what's not there that is really important enough that it should be there. If any of those other issues that we talked about, actually I would say that what's not there, in a sense, is social capital. There's a reference to community safety and security, but if social capital is so valued as it appears to be, I want to think about adding that as a category and then figuring out how you measure that. If we compare it to what matters in Victoria, I want to do this because I used this morning to lead into this next little piece, and then I'm going to wrap this up and give you a chance to have some conversation. If you look at and do a bit of a grouping around what matters in Victoria, and if you're a bit manipulative, which I tend to be, you can make it fit into 5 key categories. And these are they. So in Victoria, and certainly here, big emphasis on a high quality natural environment, but also on a high quality built environment. Perhaps more so in Victoria, it's more urban, but you had transportation, you had planning, you had housing as part of your issues. So that is an important part of our environment. So natural capital, built capital, certainly very strongly here, as they had there, that sense of community and belonging and the security that comes with that. So one reason why you don't worry so much about security perhaps is because you have that sense of community capital and social capital rather. Fourthly, clearly, a prosperous economy. We need that. Affordable and a decent standard of living and low levels of poverty, all part of the economic capital. And then finally, a level of human development, which to me is the core, the essence of the whole thing. And that encompasses health and well-being, early child development, learning, arts, recreation, culture, many of those things you had as well. So I think that those same 5 forms of capital that I've put here would also fit well here in here. So this is a model, and I actually am kind of grateful to the Victoria Foundation who took my usual model and made it much more jazzy and attractive. Those are those 5 forms of capital I just talked about. And it's really, there's 3 pieces to this. The first is everything exists within natural capital. We have one planet, there aren't any spares. We'd better learn how to live on it and with it. And right now we're not doing that. That's another whole speech, which is the one I gave in Australia, and we'd be happy to give some other day maybe, or in the pub afterwards. So natural capital, we have to live within natural limits. Social capital, we've talked about that. Built capital, the fact that we are living in built environments most of the time is really important, and this extends in certain, this also includes highway systems, energy systems, transportation systems. You could include, I think, agricultural systems. We have either built or modified most of what we see. That's less so and less apparent up here. The pipelines, that's a big concern here. That's another part of built capital, really, if you think about it. And then the financial capital, which is the money and the income and the stocks and the shares and this and that. And of course a lot of that is vested in built capital too. But those 3 spheres overlap. And tomorrow I'll talk about some of the implications of those overlaps and what fits in as issues within the overlaps. I'm not going to do that tonight. But at the center where they overlap, that's where I think human capital is. Human capital being about us, about what capacity we have as individuals. And in my view, the way you maximize human capital is to integrate social and built and financial capital so that they're all working together for the same end. And if you think of those, because right now the way we manage society is that those 3 or 4 or 5 circles don't even touch. They're separate silos that we deal with as if you looked on the top of silos, you'd see 5 circles, completely distinct. And that's how we manage our society. It doesn't make any sense, because they interact and interconnect all the time. So how do you bring them together? How do you merge them? And what are the trade-offs? And the trick around governance then is making those trade-offs, is finding the right balance so that ultimately you maximize human capital, human development, human well-being. So I want to close with some implications, and I've already talked about this, that the health and well-being is at the center. That, in my view, should be our real measure of progress as a community or as a society. How well are we doing? All of us, that is. Not just, it's not about human development for a few, or human development for some. Not even about human development for many. It's about human development for all. How do you maximize the human potential of every single person in the community, whatever their level of potential might be, and they differ, of course. And everything we do occurs within the limits of one Earth. That's a second implication. The third implication, I've talked about a fair bit, I won't beat the drum on it anymore, but built capital is really important. And a fourth implication is that all of these interact. Yet, as I said, we organize our society as if they were a bunch of unconnected, unrelated silos, and react as if there were no limits to growth, when indeed there are. So, I've been using the term capital very deliberately in all of these, partly because notions of natural capital and social capital and human capital are quite widespread in society anyway, but also because you have to think about capitalism. And what I'm suggesting is that in the 21st century we need a different form of capitalism, which is a form of capitalism that grows all 5 forms of capital simultaneously. Now that's a trick, that's not easy. And probably some bits would grow more than others, but what you don't want is a form of capitalism that grows the economy by depleting the other forms of capital. And we certainly do that with respect to natural capital. We sometimes do it even with respect to social and human capital. So we need to rethink what we mean by capitalism if we're going to continue to live in a capitalistic society, and we can debate the merits of that if you like, but I'm not seriously debating that. What I'm saying is that we live in a capitalist society, but for goodness sake, let's create a form of capitalism that works for people, that makes more sense than the current system. So I'm saying we need a new form of capitalism to simultaneously grow all 5. In addition, we need new systems of governance. So how do we establish that balance? How do we make those trade-offs? Government alone, whether it's provincial, federal, or municipal, cannot do this. There's lots of other players out there who have an impact, who are stakeholders, who are key players. So you've got to bring in the private sector, the non-profit sector, the academic sector, the faith sector, the community sector, all of those. So how do we all sit down together and find some common purpose and some common goals, which of course is why it's easier to do at a local level. Not that it's a slam dunk, it never is, but there's an intimacy to the local setting in terms of policy making, in terms of democratic participation. You know your mayor, you bump into him. I saw him at the airport. We come out of the airport and about almost every person, he's saying, hi, how are you? You know your mayor. How many of you know the premier of the province? How many of you know the prime minister? We don't know them, they're remote. Here there's an intimate setting for making making policy and making change, and that's a real advantage. And also because municipalities, as I said at the outset, we don't use GDP. They already use these broader measures. That's why your activity here is so important, because you're really setting the example. I would argue that provincial and federal governments need to be looking at what happens in municipalities and learning from them, not the other way around, because local communities and local municipalities do get it. And they're the places where change happens, partly because there's many of them, and so there's lots of room for experimentation. Partly because, as I said, they're more intimate and more nimble. But change often happens here, whether it's taking on smoking or greenhouse gas reductions or homelessness or drugs or whatever it may be. It usually starts first at the local level. So I'm a great believer in think globally and act locally, and that's really what this is all about. So the challenge is, what are the new systems and processes of governance that we need in order to do this, and also to do this in the 21st century? Social media, heard of social media? It's a different world out there. It's going to be an increasingly different world. So what does democracy look like in the 21st century in an age of social media, and whatever else there may be to come? So how do we build all forms of capital while maximizing human development in a way that is socially just and ecologically sustainable? That's the challenge that every community and every society faces in the 21st century. And places like Smithers that are prepared to pick this up and do something about it, you're the vanguard of the change we need. A couple of other thoughts and another example, in this case from Belo Horizonte, but how many people here have heard of participatory budgeting? Did you do participatory budgeting here?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay. Well, there's something to put on the checklist. Basically, you engage the community in deciding how to spend a portion of the budget. Now in large cities, that's done at a local level. So how would this neighbourhood take 10% of the recreation department's budget or the roads budget or whatever it may be and decide how to spend it locally? You don't give them the money because there's still an accountability issue back to government, but they set the priorities, set direction. It engages people in some meaningful discussion. And it's a way of learning about how to do that too. Using ideas such as crowdsourcing and the internet to develop new constitutions nationally or new legislation in Finland or issues going before the parliament in Germany. And then in Belo Horizonte, my favorite example in Brazil, they actually have a municipal deputy secretary of democratic governance. Why wouldn't every municipality in the country have a position like that? Everyone that was big enough to have enough staff to do that. I think it's a hugely important issue. The role of democratic governance in the communities of the 21st century. And having someone whose job it is to think about that and encourage that and support that, I think it's a hugely important job for governments. So, it begins with identifying what matters, then you have to measure what matters, and that way you can manage what matters. So, I'm happy that you're doing what you're doing. I'm happy to be able to be here and be part of it, and thank you. And now the floor is yours.
Do you want to take questions from the audience?
Oh, happy to. Brickbats, bouquets, I take them all. Or just straight questions.
I was just surprised not to see the word employment anywhere. Is that a subset somewhere, or?
Well, I think it's two things. I mean, yes, it is a subset. It's a subset of the economy. And of course, there's employment and there's self-employment, which are not quite the same thing necessarily. But they are in economic terms, I guess. And then, of course, there's all the work that gets done that is paid work, but is good work, which is that piece GDP misses. But no, I mean, I think it's part of the economic sector. That's what we look to the economic sector to do, in large part, is to create employment.
So in your presentation, you've emphasized that public engagement component, and you've noted that we're coming into a new world with social media and whatnot. I'm wondering if you have experience at this point with any of the new digital platforms for both deliberative democracy and that public consultation, as well as actual online voting.
No, I don't, not personally. I mean, I think they're very interesting. I think we're going to see and need to see a whole lot of experimentation around that, some of which will work and some of which won't. But we need to be trying it. I'm not engaged in that aspect of it, but I'm a very interested observer of it. I certainly think some of the ideas around that I touched on in Finland and Germany, where electronic initiatives can end up. The way I think it works in, I'm not sure if it's Finland or Germany, is not that there has to be a bill passed or legislation passed, but that if enough people sign on, the issue has to be discussed in the legislature. So it helps to put stuff on the agenda. Doesn't determine what happens to it, but at least it gets talked about. I think that's an interesting sort of approach.
For Darcy there, Lumio of New Zealand and Open Spaces.
Can you speak up a little? Sorry.
Sorry, just to help Darcy out there, Lumio of New Zealand is a really good technology that's come out for collaborative decision making on a large scale, and Open Spaces has been around for about 15 years, and they've been used in German municipalities and everything to decide a lot of different contentious issues. I know you got water, power, that you gotta deal with.
Open Space as a digital platform, or is it?
Yeah, digital as well as
as
present. And they had, I think, almost 10,000 people participate in that too.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to ask is, one thing that I've been internally involved with for the last couple of years has been how all these people metrics and everything kind of get thrown out the window when money becomes scarce. The financial world, the economic world, and maybe some people think about it, tends to, when that becomes scarce in people's minds, overtakes everything, and the baby and the bathwater is throwing up. And so how do you, I think that's more dependent on a cultural, situation. How do you reconcile that with maybe some of the implementations that you mentioned?
Well, I mean, I think it is a cultural thing. I think that's why things such as gross functional happiness, while appealing, are going to be hard to do here in this part of the world where you don't have that Buddhist culture that lies behind it. But we need something a bit like that. I do think fundamentally we're talking about very profound value shifts here. Flying up here, I glanced through the En Route magazine, on Air Canada. It really ticks me off. It's all about, look at my latest whiz-bang toy, gadget, game, sport, place, thing that makes me so much better a person because I can afford to buy it. I mean, really? I don't object to having money, but it's not the be-all and end-all of my life, and I suspect that's true for many of us. But there is this culture of greed, the celebrity culture, a whole bunch of other things that encourage that. We looked at what big CEOs make or big sports people make or whatever. And something's faintly obscene about all of that, actually. But that's a cultural shift. And I don't expect that everyone in this room would agree with me that it's obscene. But we need to be having a debate about that sort of thing and about what is it that we value as a society. Because right now, as you said, clearly, and GDP is a wonderful example of that. That's what we pursue in large degree. It's not the only thing, I realise that, but it is a major driver. So we are going to have a debate and a culture, and ultimately a cultural shift. I just completed a major report with my colleagues for the Canadian Public Health Association on the ecological determinants of health. And actually, as part of that, because it's pretty grim news when you look at what's happening globally to our ecosystems, we had a whole chapter on imagining a better future. And we had a whole chapter on hope. And we identified some signs of hope, and I think they're relevant to this conversation too. One of those signs of hope was that we have been here before, in a sense. Now, we were talking in the context of ecological change, not quite what you were talking about. But if you were to go back into the 1840s and land in Manchester with a life expectancy for the low-income populations there of 17 years, and looked at the appalling conditions, you'd have kind of thrown your hands up in despair and said, what can we do? But in fact, we changed all of that. If you, 30 years ago, people would have been smoking in this room. We wouldn't have thought twice about it. So what we take from that is not the specifics, but the general point that significant value shifts and cultural shifts can happen, and they can happen quite fast, in fact. So I think part of it is we have to be talking about this. You know, we have to be, for example, exposing the idiocy of measuring anything by GDP and then navigating by it. But if we don't start to have that conversation, then some of those issues don't even surface. So it is a fundamental value shift. But I guess I'm somewhat inspired by Gandhi's comment that there's enough for each person's greed, but not for each person's need, but not each person's greed. You know, the world is still a rich place, but we have to find other forms of richness. That's a significant culture shift. Sorry, I had a question over here, and then I'll come back to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really happy that you're addressing the human factor and not just the monetary factor. But I do think there's a big elephant in the room, because we're talking about community vitality, but we're living with a diseased population. So you're doing all these beautiful things to basically herd a population that is full of disease. Mental, physical, emotional. So wouldn't it make more sense to throw a model like this, but start by bringing more health into the population, and then actually start creating the infrastructure? So I'm very confused about this, right? Because it's like, when a fish swims in the water, does he see the water? Not many people here will maybe understand what I'm saying. Right? But it's like, when this platform of diseased population anywhere in the Western world is going to meetings like this, and we're creating all these beautiful programs, but we're still diseased. We're still full of cancer. We still need our pain pills. We still need to go to the doctors and therapists.
Well, okay,
Address that, please.
oh boy. How many hours?
That's my find is where we should start.
How many hours do you have? Because I spent my life working in that area. First off, we're actually, by and large, a quite healthy population. There is disease out there, but on the whole, if you ask, for example, people to report on how healthy they feel, if you look at measures, most people do not have major health problems, and at some point in their lives they're going to get one, and we need to care for it when that happens. One of the things we have done, and my profession is very guilty of this, is we have medicalized a whole lot of problems that really were never medical problems anyway, and treated them with drugs and so on when they really don't need that, when they need to be seen as community issues. There's a famous John McKnight article where he talked about, they did a survey in a low-income community in Chicago looking at the health problems. And the way they measured it was they looked at the problems that were presenting in the emergency room of the local hospital. And when they had done that and they reported back to the community about these issues, which were about motor vehicle crashes, because the low-income neighborhood was a place where a lot of commuters came through to get to their downtown jobs, or when they looked at dog bites, which was an issue in the community. In fact, one of the major things that brought people to the ER and so on. Someone in the room said, well, those aren't medical problems, those are our problems. And the way that they dealt with those problems was not to medicalize them, to set up a system to deal with them, but in fact to, well, for the dog problem, they kind of set up a bounty for collecting the stray dogs, which was the source of the dog bites, and the kids thought that was a great idea and went out and captured the stray dogs and made some money. End of problem. So we do tend to medicalize problems that are actually social problems, and I think one of the ways that we know that you build health is through community, through connection. So when you talk about as an asset and a strength here, that sense of community, we have that. We need to build on that, but again, it's a matter of whether you're seeing the glass half empty or half full, and I guess you'd be seeing it half empty and I'm seeing it half full. But most of the things that determine the health of a population have nothing to do with healthcare. That's why I'm no longer in the business of medical care. Because after 4 years of family practice, I felt like I was constantly patching people up and sending them back into battle, but not doing anything to stop the war. And to stop the war, you have to move upstream and look at what is making people sick in the first place, rather than set up the repair system to fix them. I mean, you want to have that for humane reasons, but that shouldn't be your primary strategy. But we could talk some more, but that's a quick initial response. I said I'd come over here.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that topic. I find the whole talk very stimulating. There's lots of different things that I could engage in here personally. Very interesting. I just wanted to just throw the topic of freedom into the room, and particularly to you, how measuring freedom of individuals in society ties into the wellness of the culture. And in particular in this area, I want to talk about economic freedom, which was touched on by my neighbor here. I can see a real great need for more employment, not only by well people, but maybe by people who are who have gone away, gone to university, where they fit in our community. Then on the other hand, people with disabilities such as FASD or mental illness, I would like to see their more economic involvement. I'm sorry, I'm getting long. I'm just trying to suggest where my thinking is going. And I'm looking at freedom for all of us in terms of how much of our life are we working to own our homes? How free really are we when we have to kind of work at a job that doesn't suit us just to pay the tab for everything? And quite frankly, having lived a little while in this culture, so being a little on the older side, I'm just seeing the prices that people charge start to become kind of offensive to the older people in the culture, because we remember when people did really good work for a pretty modest sum of money, and now it seems like I'm engaging people who will do shoddy work for too much money. And so how about our economic freedom and our freedom?
Well, in some ways that goes back to that issue about values again, and what are we charging and what are we pursuing in order to do that? What do we think we need to have in order to have a successful life? So again, a quite profound set of issues about where our values sit. Certainly there are many people in the world who have a lot less than we do, and historically a lot of people who had less than we do who were perfectly happy and perfectly healthy. In fact, compared to us, really not any worse off. In my own case, for example, I realized when I went back there 30 years later, I spent a year in Borneo in a small community. There wasn't even a road to get in there. You could only get in by river or by a boat round the coast at the time. And I spent a year there as a volunteer. I was 18. And I went back 30 years later. And it was only when I got back there that I realized that some of my inspiration for healthy communities, perhaps a lot of it came from that experience, because I had come from London in the mid-1960s into a community that had very little in material terms, didn't have much in the way of healthcare and so on. But that was a community of basically pretty happy, well-functioning people for the most part. And so it sort of taught me a lesson about the fact that you don't have to have all the bells and whistles to make it work. I think that the challenge in that also is that we have to think about this without talking about what we need to do is go back to the 1820s or the 1930s or whatever. This isn't about going back, it's about going forward. It's about what is the better future we want to create, and that would address some of those sorts of issues. And I don't have the answers for how we deal with some of those things, but I do know that that's part of the conversation we need to be having. And as to freedom itself, I think that's an important part of it, but I think with freedom comes responsibility, and so you have to measure and you have to engage both. You're only free to do what you like as long as it hurt no other, is a basic principle to live by, I think. So with that freedom comes the responsibility to others. So I'm not sure that's an answer, but it's, the beginning of a discussion. You've got 100 people in the room or whatever it is. Send out an invite, convene a group, have a conversation, get something going. Another question, I think somewhere back here, or a comment. So.
Just one of the things that I've kind of noticed, that you place such a heavy emphasis on the way that we sort of base a lot of our decisions and the way that we sort of govern in policy around the idea of GDP. And I think one of the issues, especially, is that when we kind of look at GDP, we see it as a justification, in the sense that when we look at things from a financial standpoint, it creates justification for the way that we spend money on things like social programs and healthcare and all that kind of stuff. And it's difficult to get away from that mentality that without, and I agree with what you said, that I think it's a ridiculous way to sort of look at essentially what we're worth and then how we spend what we're worth. And it's hard, I think, in a culture like ours, to move away from the idea that understanding what we're worth justifies what we spend. And that's kind of, I think I'm starting to see trends that are moving away from that. And it's refreshing, but I mean, it's still something that's so deeply integrated into every aspect of our lives that if we can't justify the way that we spend on ourselves and as a community based on essentially what we know we're worth, then when we do kind of see, we almost call it frivolous, that we see things that some people might consider to be great social programs and initiatives to improve the healthcare of the community might be seen as people as frivolous and unnecessary.
Yeah, I think that there is this beginning of a shift. So, for example, I thought it was very important that President Sarkozy, when he was President of France, established a commission, the Stiglitz Commission, to look at alternative measures of progress. So that thinking is happening in some places at national levels like that. The UN recently passed a resolution in favour of investigating alternative measures. So I think both at the local level here and at those national and even international levels, there is that rethinking beginning to happen. It's going to take a very long time to get those shifts, but they're not going to happen at all if we don't start the conversation. And so I think, remember, GDP, certainly as GDP, didn't exist till the 1930s. Now we've had other ways of measuring progress and measuring the economy and so on, and it's not that we're not going to measure the economy, it's that we need to give more balance to what else we measure along with the economy. So by all means measure the economy, but also measure human progress. And if you take the GPI, for example, where you see the economy going up but the GPI flatlining, that's an important message that we need to pay attention to. And you only get that if you measure those other things. So we need to change a lot of the ways that we measure, because, again, to bring it back to your own situation, what matters here? Jobs and the economy matter here. But the other thing to think about, I think, is what sort of jobs and what sort of economy. In our report for the Canadian Public Health Association, part of what we talked about was that we need to divest from the old technologies and the old industries and invest instead in the new, the emerging industries. So as you look at notions of social entrepreneurship and social innovation that are coming out, where companies are looking to maximize several forms of the bottom line, natural capital and social capital as well. They're talking about social profit along with economic profit and those sorts of things. Those companies and those new businesses They are the business of the future. So we need to be investing more in those. A lot of those are starting as local enterprises and then growing. So I think that's part of what we have to think. I mean, where we put our pension funds, for example. The Faculty Association at the University of Victoria voted 6 or 9 months ago to divest from fossil fuels in the pension portfolio. Small problem. The pension fund is governed by provincial legislation which requires it to maximise return, and so they see themselves as having a fiduciary duty to continue to invest in fossil fuels. So we've got to fight that one. Of course, there's now some evidence. There was a report from a financial agency or organisation in London not so long ago that compared the economic return on a portfolio with and without fossil fuels. And the one without fossil fuels did slightly better than the one with fossil fuels. And certainly, no matter all the brickbats thrown at Linda McQuaig, we are going to have to keep most of the fossil fuel that we know about in the ground if we're going to avoid large-scale global warming well beyond the 2 degrees centigrade target. So, probably not a smart move, not financially smart to continue to invest in fossil fuels. Because their assets are not what actually their assets are on paper, and not what they're actually going to be as we shift away. And also because why wouldn't we subsidise those industries quite heavily? Well, don't change anything else, just take that subsidy and shift it. So I think we have to think about what are the new industries, what's the new economy, what's the new forms of work and employment that we need, and what sort of value, what's the return on investment, not just in economic terms, but in social terms and ecological terms. Where was I? There was somebody here. Yes? Okay.
Not to cast aspersions on the residents of Victoria, like yourself included. Quite a ways back in the regional demonstration, there was a bullet on one of the surveys conducted in Victoria about sewage treatment and disposal, and I saw that it was a rather low number in terms of importance. I was wondering what our illustrious Premier, Christy Clark, is doing to get Victoria out of the medieval times and stop dumping sewage into the harbor in Victoria.
Well,
I
think what she's doing is putting as much distance between herself and that issue as she can. I think what needs to happen is put the damn sewage treatment in place. And I have no problems with that at all. I think the fact is that you saw it as fairly low down on that list of issues. A couple of years ago it wasn't even there. So it's become an issue. So that's the good news. It's not maybe where you'd like to see it, but at least it's on the list, and a couple of years ago it wasn't, but I think that should just happen. Anyway.
I think Carmen's been waiting for
Oh, I'm sorry.
Your comment about being in Borneo and seeing an indigenous community there, and how they operate and what happiness looks like, progress looks like there, brings to mind indigenous communities in Canada. And I'm wondering if you're aware of any First Nations communities that are doing work currently in this area, quality of life kind of indication?
Well, I think in a sense they all are. I know certainly the Songhees Nation in Victoria have recently opened a large community wellness centre specifically around these sorts of issues of both spiritual and cultural and physical and mental wellness. And that's the model. The First Nations Health Authority has a comprehensive wellness model at the focus of what it does. So it's starting from a wellness perspective. So I think we're seeing things like that. There was a First Nation in Quebec some years ago that won UN awards because it had built a very sustainable community on its land. So I think that, yeah, there's definitely some interesting developments there that we can learn from.
Thank you so much, Trevor, and thanks everyone for sticking around. On behalf of the organizing committee, I'd like to once again thank Dr. Hancock for traveling all this way and sharing his thoughts with us. I think probably some of you are inspired, maybe some people are perplexed, and others might be provoked. The idea here was really to spark a conversation about what matters to us, how we see ourselves as a community among so many other communities, and how we can measure that together over time so that we know if we're indeed moving forward. One thing Dr. Hancock mentioned was about going upstream, and I have to give credit to Northern Health, which has shifted a bit of its focus in recent years, starting to looking at the social determinants of health instead of simply how do we become more efficient at patching up sick people, looking at why people are getting sick and working in communities. And tonight is part of one of those initiatives, working with local governments to build on-the-ground strategies for healthier communities. So once again, thank you so much to Dr. Hancock. If you have ideas, please do write them on the board on the way out on your left. And I hope that this is a conversation that keeps going for a long time. I believe it's one of the most important ones, because if we don't talk about what matters to us, how are we going to know that we're doing the right things? So thank you everyone for giving us your evening and spending time with us, and we hope to see you soon. Have a good evening.